The killer in this case was sat in an interview room being questioned by police. He had a pack of cards with him, and at one point he picked up a 4 of heart card and he told police, quote, "This is the MasterCard. It means you've got 4 bodies and a madman on the loose." That man was just 21 years old and he had committed the brutal slaying of 4 people. He's the youngest person in the UK to be convicted and sentenced to a whole life prison term, a sentence reserved for the most heinous of criminals. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episodes are accurate to the source materials I can find. You can find all episodes as a podcast or YouTube version in the description box down below. Guys, I don't know how this has happened. I know last week's episode was pretty gory, but this one is too. I usually try and really vary the cases I tell week to week, and this case in itself is very different, but in terms of gore or what actually happened, it really is in definite need of some kind of disclaimer. I know you're watching true crime content, so you're probably going to be expecting it, but this one really is up there. I've actually been working on a completely different case for most of the past week, but it's quite a long one. There are a fair few different murders. It's quite complex and it's going to take me a little while to write, so hopefully that will be out at the end of this week or the beginning of next week. But in terms of today, I did really want to tell you this story. I could not believe I haven't heard of it, especially being from the UK and being quite familiar with South Yorkshire, which is where it's set. So, enough of my chat. Let's get into it. It was on the 28th of August 1988 that a man called Raymond Ford was at his home in a small South Yorkshire town, and he was settling into his evening. He'd sat down in his armchair and he was doing his usual evening routine of settling down, relaxing, maybe doing a crossword on the Guardian newspaper. Now, Raymond worked as a school teacher, and in 1988 he was 45 years old. He hadn't had the best of luck recently. His house had been burgled. He'd returned home one day to find that a number of windows of his had been broken, they'd been smashed in, and a couple of things that he owned were missing, things like his microwave oven and one of his clocks. Raymond had immediately reported the crime, and it seems that a statement was taken from him, and Raymond told them exactly who had done this. He knew it was someone who had been tormenting him for years, an ex-student of his called Anthony Arkwright. Anthony had no problem in hurling verbal and physical abuse towards Raymond. He would go out of his way to find dog poo, pick it up, and then post it through his old teacher's front door. He had even smashed the windows to Raymond's house sometime before the burglary, a few weeks before. But on this particular Sunday, after Raymond had settled into his lounge area, resting in his chair, he eventually fell asleep. The next events that I talk about are from the killer's eventual confession. We have a fair few details, but warning here, they're pretty gory. It was 3 a.m. and Raymond was fast asleep in his chair when he likely heard a noise or felt something change in the house. It was then that he would have opened his eyes and he would have seen a person standing down looking at him, only he wouldn't have been able to tell who this person was. He wouldn't have been able to see their face because they were wearing a devil mask. The man in front of him was also stark naked and he was holding a knife. Now, before Raymond could think of anything to do, the figure in front of him brought that knife down with such ferocity and force that it rendered Raymond completely unable to move or defend himself. The figure pulled the knife up and stabbed Raymond again and again, and this continued for some time, with the knife wounds getting deeper and more severe, until eventually the force that the figure had been stabbing with caused the knife to actually break. The figure then left the room, heading into the kitchen for a few moments, before returning soon after, this time with a new knife. And so the attack continued. Altogether, Raymond was stabbed somewhere between 250 and 500 times. The number is reported to varying degrees in different sources, but to be honest, with that amount of stab wounds, it's probably quite unlikely that there would be able to be a specific number determined. We do know that it was a lot, and we do know that this caused Raymond to bleed out pretty quickly. It's likely that Raymond knew exactly who was behind this attack as it was happening, despite the devil mask being on the perpetrator's face. There was only one person that he knew had an absolute hatred of him and had bullied him for many, many years, making his life incredibly challenging over the few years. He knew the killer was his ex-student Anthony Arkwright, but even after it was clear that Raymond was long dead, Anthony was not finished. He used that same knife to gut and disembowel Raymond, and then he draped his intestines all around the room. As I said at the beginning, this is a pretty extreme crime, and fair warning, we are nowhere near done yet. There is much more to come. But I think in order to fully understand the context of Anthony and really get to grips with the murders he committed, is to look at who this guy actually was. Anthony Arkwright was born into a family full of little kids in 1967 in a small South Yorkshire town in England. In total, there were 5 siblings and his mum and dad, and they just couldn't cope, or they didn't want to look after them. To be honest, there isn't a huge amount of information on the reasoning for why his parents stopped looking after them. But what we do know is that all of the children were soon taken into care when Anthony was very, very young. As a result of this, being in the care system so young and being in the care system in the 70s and 80s, Anthony found himself really not connecting with his foster home or with his care homes, and he found himself rebelling inside of school and outside of it. Oftentimes, he just wouldn't even go into school. And he spent his teenage years skipping it. He began testing the limits outside of school and outside of his foster home. And he started that with petty theft, which soon progressed to violent, more aggressive criminal acts. By the time he was 18 years old, Anthony was in and out of prison regularly. And this, of course, I mean, he's 18 years old. He is in an adult prison, but he is still young. Most other 18-year-olds in this situation, the other offenders, they were taken advantage of by other inmates. They were picked on, bullied. But Anthony was different. It's reported he came across as threatening and was actually quite scary to the other inmates, even the older, more experienced ones. And so mainly, he was left to himself. During his time in prison, there wasn't a whole lot to do, but what the prisoners could do was read. And Anthony really took to reading, but he had a very specific interest, and that was in serial killers. He would read book after book about serial killers' lives, biographies outlining their crimes and their motivations. And the more he read, the more inspired he was. Now, on one of Anthony's releases, he was given a flat to go and live in, and he arrived and started kind of setting up his life, but only so much as getting moved in and then going and looking for an occasional bit of work. And this, for him, would be doing some sort of manual labour. At one point he worked at a scrapyard and he was doing odd jobs here and there, but he didn't really feel like he had a purpose, and he had no desire to keep any of his jobs. He went through a lot of them, and his work ethic was pretty much non-existent. He'd either turn up late or do half the job, or just not show up at all. And so it was never long after he started a job that he was fired and he'd have to move on. Of course, Anthony had this council flat, but he was less interested in properly setting up his life there and more interested in seeing what kind of trouble he could get into outside of the flat. He had a tent that he would set up in a field nearby to where he lived, and oftentimes he'd go out there and camp out for no specific reason. It was just to keep an eye on who was out there and potential victims, is what he would later say. It seems he never actually did anything at this point, but he was just thinking about it. And just being nearby, being in the tent, having the potential to make someone his next victim, that was thrilling enough for him, at least for now. Anyway, of all the serial killers he read about, Anthony really admired Jack the Ripper. He knew everything about him, excluding obviously his actual identity. Anthony knew his habits, he knew who he killed, how he killed them, and something that really interested him greatly was the exact way in which Jack the Ripper dealt with his victims after they were dead. He read about how the famous serial killer would remove his victims' organs, how he seemed to have some kind of surgical knowledge. One of Jack the Ripper's victims, Mary Jane Kelly, was found with her face, quote, hacked beyond recognition, and with her throat severed down to her spine. She also had her uterus, her kidney, and one of her breasts cut off and placed underneath her head. Her heart had also been taken from the crime scene. Anthony admired this. He knew all of the ins and outs of Jack the Ripper's signatures and he wanted to repeat them. And so back to where we left the story, Anthony's just murdered Raymond, he'd disemboweled him, and he'd left the crime scene and he's completely covered in Raymond's blood. And so he headed back to his flat to get cleaned up. He got into the shower, washed all of the blood off of him, and then he waited. He knew the police would be round to see him soon, and sure enough, at 7 a.m, there was a knock on his front door, and he opened it and the police were standing there. He prepared himself to be arrested for the murder of Raymond, but as the police started talking, it became very clear they weren't there to arrest him for the murder. Yes, they were there to arrest him, but this was just for the burglary on Raymond's house a few days earlier. They were there to deal with that charge. They hadn't actually found Raymond yet. No one knew that he was dead. Now, Anthony had known that Raymond would have known it was him who burgled his house and would have reported it to police. Somehow he found out about that and this infuriated him. Anyway, Raymond went straight down to the police station with the officers and into the interview room. When they were inside, they did end up questioning him for a total of 3 hours, but eventually they released him on bail on the condition that he would return on a specific day the following week for his court appearance. As soon as he was out of the station, he headed home. When he was there, he simply went to sleep, he got some rest, before waking up in the evening and heading out to a local pub. And then throughout the evening and the early hours of the next morning, he was drinking and just kept knocking back pints of beer until finally, in the early hours of the morning, he was kicked out. Instead of going home though, Anthony walked straight past his house and continued on towards the neighbour's house. The neighbour who lived inside was 25-year-old Marcus Law. He'd been involved in a motorcycle accident when he was younger, and so he relied on a wheelchair to get around. He'd had his house adapted to make it accessible, and Anthony had known him for a number of years. When the two would meet, it was a very casual kind of neighbourly relationship. The two would meet outside occasionally. They would share a cigarette. Oftentimes, Marcus would ask Anthony for a cigarette. Anthony would then ask Marcus for a cigarette at a different time. But for some reason, sort of impossible to guess, to try and figure out the reason why, but Anthony thought that Marcus had somehow wronged him in continuing to ask him for a cigarette. Bear in mind, these two have been neighbours for a number of years by this point. They know each other well enough to talk about each other's family members, to have regular chats, but Anthony had gotten it in his head that Marcus was somehow taking advantage of him by continuing to ask for cigarettes. Because of this, after visiting the pub that night and getting more and more drunk, he went straight up to Marcus's front door, looked inside, managed to sneak round the side of the house, and he forced his way inside. He ended up stabbing Marcus over 70 times. And then he tried to repeat what he'd done earlier to Raymond and disembowel his second victim. The issue was that this time, for some reason, he wasn't able to do that with the knife. And so he took one of Marcus's crutches and he used that to dig it into his abdomen and start disemboweling him. After that, he gouged both of Marcus's eyes out, and then he smoked a cigarette before... This is just, I don't even know why I was surprised or shocked, but I definitely was. He then used Marcus's eye sockets as an ashtray. He is that comfortable around this dead man's body, a man that he knows and has now not only killed but also completely mutilated. He feels that comfortable just being around his body that he sits and has a cigarette. Eventually he did leave the house. Now, in a horrific turn of events, later that day, Anthony was walking down the street when he just so happened to pass Marcus's mother. He recognised her because they'd met before, and so he went up to her and he told her how sorry he was for the loss of her son and that he'd been murdered. The thing was, no one knew about the murder at this point. Marcus hadn't been found yet. Marcus's mother then rushed round to his house, and that's when she found his mutilated body. Of course, now she had a bit of information on the crime. She had been told this information by someone who couldn't possibly have known without actually having been involved in the crime itself. And so police immediately arrested Anthony and they brought him to an interview room. It was during that interview that Anthony got that pack of cards out that I spoke about way at the beginning of telling this case, and he started talking about the 4 people that he'd killed or that were dead. Now at this point, police only knew of Marcus's death. They didn't know that Raymond had also been killed or these other potential 2 victims. And so that's when they looked into Anthony's background, into his criminal record, and they found Raymond's details on a previous complaint. And so they went round to his house, and of course that's where they found that grisly scene and found that he had been dead for some time. After that, they continued searching for these other alleged victims, but they had no luck. It wasn't until an entire week after Anthony's arrest that they came across the 3rd victim, Anthony's own grandfather, Stanislav Podolska. Anthony had been working his job at the scrapyard the previous week when he had been given a letter, and this letter he sort of scanned down it and he saw that his contract was being terminated, he was being fired. Anthony's bosses had simply had enough of him swanning in and out, just not turning up for work and not doing a very good job when he was there. Even though being fired wasn't necessarily a surprise to Anthony, he was still raging and he needed someone to take his anger out on. He used his final paycheck to go to the pub and drown his sorrows, as was often the case with Anthony. And then once he started drinking, he didn't want to stop, and he ended up getting very drunk and also very angry. He soon left the pub and went round to his grandfather's house, but when he arrived, he couldn't find Stanislav anywhere around the house, and so he knew that he would be in the only other place he could possibly think of. He would be at his beloved allotment. When he arrived at the allotment, his grandfather turned round and greeted him, and that's when Anthony pulled out a knife and started stabbing his grandfather over and over and over again. The force of the knife and the wounds that they created to his spinal cord caused Stanislav to become paralysed. He was still alive, but barely, and tragically he was no longer able to move, which is just a nightmare to think about in itself. Anthony then dragged Stanislav's body to his shed. He then rummaged around for another weapon, something he could use to inflict some more kind of damage. And then he found a hammer lying on the floor. He picked it up and he brought it down with such a huge amount of force onto Stanislav's head. He continued to hit him over and over again until eventually his anger had subsided and his grandfather was very much dead. It was only after that he eventually headed to the pub before eventually heading round to his ex-teacher Raymond's house, and we know the rest from there. What we don't know is exactly when the 4th murder happened. It turns out at some point, likely around the time he murdered his grandfather, potentially just before, Anthony had also killed his grandfather's housemaid, Elsa. Elsa was 73 years old, and Anthony actually never admitted to her murder. I'm not really sure why that is. And of course, the likelihood of him killing 3 people over the course of a few hours, and then this one person turning up murdered, but him not being the perpetrator, just highly unlikely. As for the other 3 victims though, Anthony had no problem in admitting that he murdered them. But not only that, Anthony said there was still one more person he had killed, but the police hadn't yet found. Now, the police did try and follow up on this, but interestingly, Anthony actually couldn't give them any useful details or specifics about the death. He couldn't even say who it was. Eventually, police theorised that there was no 5th victim. Anthony had made it all up just because he wanted to have the same number of victims at the very least as his idol, Jack the Ripper. Anthony was given a series of psychological examinations and he was found to be sane and was ordered to stand trial. The trial took place at Sheffield Crown Court in July of 1989 and Anthony ended up pleading not guilty. But within this, he did eventually admit to the murders of Stanislav, Raymond and Marcus, but maintaining he had nothing to do with Elsa's murder. Anthony's defence tried to argue that he was suffering from personality damage and disorder. Quote, "He has shown signs of disturbance from the time his mother left him at the age of 4, but Ultimately, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. This was, however, changed to a whole life tariff when it was realised that he would be able to be up for release in 2015. And to this day, he remains behind bars. So, thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Red Rum. This week, I have a recommendation that is a real niche one. I've only done this or one like this once before, and you actually only have a week to see it. It's only going to be for my UK listeners, I guess. I don't expect you to fly over for it. To be honest, it might only interest you if you're like Midlandsy, South Yorkshire-y. Obviously, this case was done or set in South Yorkshire, so it's kind of appropriate that I'm recommending this play, I guess. The play is called A Doll's House. It's on at the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield, and it's only going to be on for another week. It's on until Saturday the 12th? 12th of this month. It's an Ibsen, so it's classed as a classic, and let me tell you, as someone who has worked in theatre for over 10 years, I've never really been a fan of the classics. I find they don't really hold my attention. I've got a bit of a scatty brain. It goes at a million miles a minute, as you can probably tell. And so some of the older plays just don't grab me in the same way that a more modern one, maybe one suited more to my likes or my tastes, might do. But this one, it's beautiful to watch. The staging, the set, the everything. It's a real stunning piece of theatre. But above that, it's about this woman called Nora who is living this pretty unfulfilled life. She's a woman, she's a wife, which is kind of her main role in society at this time. And she kind of is thrust into this world of secrets and lies, and we witness her, I guess, downfall, but then her ultimate rise up as she really finds herself and throws out all the rules and starts to take control of every single thing that she can. Is incredibly moving. It will make you feel things. And it will probably make you angry. There were a lot of women and girls in the audience who were as infuriated as I was as the play progressed. It will make you feel. As I say, it's only on until the 12th of October, so it ends really, really soon. But on the off chance that even one person is watching and they fancy a trip to the theatre and are close by, I'd highly recommend it. I'll leave a link in the description box down below, of course. And other than that, I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.